If I can ask folks to take their seats, we're going to get started with the next panel. Good morning, everyone. I'm Angela Gonzalez. I'm faculty in the School of Social Transformation here at ASU. Our MC, Jacob Moore, had to step out for a few minutes, so I'm stepping in to try and fill his shoes just for a moment here to welcome our next panel. They're all here. I'd like to just, keep things moving. So I'm going to introduce Chris Sharp, who is the moderator for this session, and then he will introduce the panelists. So thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. As Dr. Gonzalez said, I'm Chris Sharp. I am a clinical assistant professor here at the Arizona State University School of Social Work, and I direct the Office of American Indian Projects. And full disclosure, I am a part of the Research on Violent Victimization Lab. So we do partner with the lab on the work that we're going to be discussing today. I do want to provide some acknowledgements, especially around this topic of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. It is a difficult topic. Many of our people have been impacted, and no doubt this topic has impacted people in our audience. We do have some advocates here that are available in case you need to step away. And we have a quiet space in the back. And so are our advocates here, maybe. So we have Katanya up there, and we have over here, Debbie over here, who can step in and assist if you need to kind of go find a quiet space. And then I just want to acknowledge our research lab members. We have students here who are really the heart of what we do. So I see Cassie up there and Katanya, who's going to be helping as an advocate. And we have a postdoctoral research fellow as well, Leo Mukosi, who's participating in this conference. And then finally, I think we'll have some study committee members here in the audience and also viewing online. I want to acknowledge you all. And then a reminder to, if you go up to the back of the bleacher seating, we have a call for art that our students led, and in our breakout rooms you'll see individual pieces of the art that are on display. And so we're really happy to be here and thankful to the organizers for allowing the art to be a part of this conference as well. So I'm going to just briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll go right into the presentations. So Dr. Kate Fox is our first panelist. Kate is a professor and the director of the Research on Violent Victimization at ASU within the School of Criminology. We have the Honorable Alfred Urbina, who is a Pascua Yaqui Attorney General and also from the Pascua Yaqui tribe. And then we have Mrs. Valaura Imus-Nahsonhoya, who is Hopi and also a partner with the ROVV lab. And she's the executive director of Honwungsi Consulting Services and the CEO of Omauw Resource Center. So without further ado, please welcome our panelists. And the order is, we'll start with Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome. Thank you all for being here today. It's an honor and a privilege for us to be here and speak with you today. I know we have a lot to cover, so we're going to move quickly. I'll share with you our agenda for our order. We're going to bounce around just a little bit, but we at least wanted to make sure this. Do we see our slides up here? Just want to make sure we get our slides up at some point. But first, we'd like to share our acknowledgements. So Jacob Moore shared ASU's land acknowledgement. We too would like to acknowledge that ASU sits on the ancestral homelands of Indigenous nations, including O'odham, Pima, and Peepash Maricopa peoples. As Chris Sharp had mentioned, this is a heavy topic, and so please feel free to take a deep breath, center yourself, and please do feel free to step out if you'd wish. and make sure that you connect with either Katanya or Debbie. And thank you both for being here as well. All right, we're up and running. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to introduce today's agenda. So first, we will share with you briefly information on the historical traumas and policies that contributed to the missing and murder of Indigenous peoples. And then we will move into legislative recommendations and advancements, followed by research partnerships and advocacy work. Lastly, we'd like to share with you some lessons learned that our team has collectively put forth in this collaboration. So this is really a partnership between advocacy, research, and legislation. So with that, Honorable Urbina will begin with the historical context of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples.
Good morning. My name is Fred Urbina. I'm the Attorney General for the Pascua Yaqui tribe. And I'm a tribal member. I'd like to say Elias and Shinyabo, Kechamalea. This is very exciting times. We just completed the last meeting for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Committee at the Arizona State Capitol yesterday. So we expect a report to be forthcoming soon. And for me, I'm going to be providing a little bit of historical context. I'm not a researcher. My background is the law. I'm a former police officer and former judge for our tribe. And for our tribe, we've been prosecuting non-Indians who commit violence against Native American women and men on our reservation. For the Pascua Yaqui tribe, our first contact with non-Indians or colonizers was 1533. Since that time, and our first contact with researchers was probably the 1880s. We found many of our artifacts, a lot of our cultural materials at the Smithsonian through research. But for us, our creation story tells of colonization. It's a talking tree that basically tells us that we're going to be visited by modern things like trains, warfare, colonizers. The tree told us that if we wanted to remain, that we would stay. If we didn't, that we can go into the ocean. And so some of us went into the ocean, some of us stayed and remained. Almost 500 years later, we're still trying to address some of the issues that was foretold to us and to our ancestors. So when we're talking about the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous persons, it has a lot of tentacles, a lot of roots in our history, in the history of colonization, in the history of federal policies and policies across the world, colonization itself, Christian papal bulls that have impacted us equally as tribes. And I've talked about colonial flashpoints with the Pascua Yaqui tribe, but it's also consistent across the board at different time periods for the 22 tribal nations in Arizona. What that has created through federal policies, through war, land dispossession, and also genocidal policies across the Southwest, across this continent. It's put us in a situation where now tribal members find themselves on reservations, sometimes far away from the original homelands that they occupied. And this reservation policy was not meant to create thriving Native communities. It was meant to deal with the Indian problem at the time. It was meant to move people away from choice land and resources and onto places where they had difficulty living. We move into the boarding school era where the same type of policies were meant to destroy the Indian family. It was meant to assimilate people back into society. Along with those general overarching policies was federal Indian law that created case law, that created the lack of criminal jurisdiction on Indian reservations, that prevented tribes from protecting their communities. For us, for the Yaqui people, we have since this time period for 500 years, we've worked to protect our way of life through different mechanisms, through warfare, through tribal leaders ensuring that that was one of our basic priorities, is protecting people. And I mentioned 1533 for the Pascua Yaqui tribe, but it was also much earlier than that in 1519 for this region of what we now call Arizona. And it's now looking forward 500 years. I've been in a position where I'm dealing with these cases either as a prosecutor, as a law enforcement officer, or as the attorney general, trying to address these problems of people being murdered and going missing. We were able to see, tribes were able to see the connections between jurisdiction, the law, federal Indian policy, and some of the restrictions we had to address this problem. It's something that has created a situation where people move back and forth off Indian reservations in order to keep their families safe, keep themselves safe as individuals. And then what you have is a situation where there's investigations that are sometimes occurring. There's investigations that aren't happening. There's a lack of information that's being shared across jurisdictions, and it's created a situation where people go missing and murdered. This through our work that will be described here shortly by Valaura and Dr. Fox. You notice this map and this slide I stole from Jacob Moore when we did a presentation together, but it depicts exactly land dispossession, the location of current tribal reservations in Arizona, and what we're trying to address through this study. The study was historic in that it was a state law that was created to address a problem that's been created by different policies, colonization, a bunch of foundational issues. That state law was introduced by the Native American caucus, tribal members that were representative in the state body, the House and the Senate. So it's historic in that it's the first time, or it's one of the first times a tribal bill has passed unanimously out of the House and Senate, signed by the governor in order for this research and study to occur. Imagine having that charge during a worldwide pandemic, a pandemic like tribes have experienced in the past. We're in a new pandemic. The state legislative body and the governor asked these folks, Representative Germain, Kate Fox, and Valaura, to put together a study to try to figure out why this is happening. Imagine how you would develop the framework to have this happen with 22 tribal nations, municipalities, the state of Arizona itself, and the federal government to try to figure this out, gather information, conduct interviews on reservations through an ASU IRB, but also the IRB and research process of each tribal nation in Arizona. Very daunting in that we weren't provided any funding and we weren't provided much time either. So that's the historical context. What I want to say about this whole issue, it's, you know, this crisis that we're addressing has taken 500 years to develop. It's something that we're not going to be able to study in the span of a year or two and address and implement changes that will affect tribes going forward. It's going to take decades for us to address this. I think of it as almost like a hurricane that comes through, and you first have to assess the issues and find the victims. But it takes those communities decades to recover. And that's exactly where we're going to find ourselves as we move forward to address this problem collectively with the state, with our federal partners, and with our tribes across the state. You know, this issue is a crisis. It's a public safety crisis. It's a public health crisis. It's also a human rights tragedy. It's something that certainly there are specific foundational and root causes, but there's also responsibilities and accountability for jurisdictions and people who have the responsibility to make sure that this is not happening. So hopefully our study will be able to illuminate some of that so that we can properly address and make sure that families have justice, make sure that loved ones are found, and make sure that we can prevent this going forward. And here's a definition of missing and murdered Indigenous persons, and there's different definitions that you'll see across the different states. This is a definition that we developed for the study committee purpose. This is also, at this point, this is the second round of legislation that also now includes both men and women and LGBTQ people in tribal communities. And I talked about some of the problems that I see from my perspective on the ground, working from a tribe to address this problem. It's not as simple as interpersonal violence that occurs in a home. There are things like the lack of housing, the non-communication between jurisdictions, between law enforcement agencies, between government officials, the lack of coordination between these bodies, both at the tribal level, at the state level, and also at the federal level. So there's many different reasons that I hope our study will address, but it's going to take us a lot of time to delve into these different areas to get more clarity and also to help prevent the matter going forward.
Sorry. Lamatalang ba askwalay umayat bitamam to about today. No Honwungsi hopi matewa, no Bill Valaura Imus-Nahsonhoya, no Omauw Resource. Good morning and thank you for being here with us. Our topic is really the emotional topic, and the work that we've done around this issue has brought up a lot of re-trauma of our survivors and our families and even our committee members. So we were very sensitive in our approaches as well. But in terms of the legislative processes, I'm very proud, and we should be proud as a state of Arizona that we were the third state in the nation to address this missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And how this came about is really about understanding and learning through Ebi Ecohawk study that Tucson was our third largest populated area that was impacted by missing and murdered. So our state, Winona Benali, former representative, she took on this action, and we had initially drafted some bills, and she elected not to run for office again and passed this on to Representative Jennifer Germain. Throughout this process, it was very challenging to get some of the support from the legislation. So it was grassroots. It was 4 women, including myself, who testified in several hearings. And one of the most impactful hearing that we had was at the Judiciary Committee. We waited over 9 hours to be heard. Many legislators thought we would leave, like many of these individuals who were there to testify as well. They'd leave. However, we as these grassroots women, we stayed, and we waited to be heard. After that hearing and our testimony, it was passed unanimously, which many other legislations after the hearing came up to us and stated they were surprised, not knowing at the time what this all meant. You know, it was very interesting to me that, you know, for whatever reason, it was doubted that this bill would pass, which was HB 2570. So these are just some examples, and Fred had mentioned earlier as well in sharing some of this information. But these are some advances that we were accomplished throughout this study. We're continuing to do this study with ASU Rove Lab and some of our legislators as well. We have experts on our committee that bring a lot of their experiences and knowledge to be able to address this issue. I'm going to share a little bit more regarding some of our outcomes. But I'll pass it on to Kate at this time.
Thank you, Valaura. So I'd like to just share briefly and acknowledge our team. This is the Research on Violent Victimization team, including Valaura Imus-Nahsonhoya, Chris Sharp as Associate Director, Leo Makosi, who is our postdoctoral scholar, and then also our, as Chris Sharp had mentioned, our critically important student members who are here. So Cassie Harvey and Katanya Begay, and also one of our members, student members who's not able to be here, Kaylee Stanek. So this was our team, in addition to several others from 2020 when this legislation was first passed. And with $0 in funding, we were able to financially support several Indigenous students on this team. And so, okay, here we go. And so we're very proud of our work in being able to do this in the pandemic and with no funding. So really we started from a problem solution standpoint. And the problem is missing and murdered Indigenous peoples is happening. It's happening at high rates. And yet there's very little data out there and knowledge about what's happening, when it's happening, who's perpetrating this, and so on. I'd like to just acknowledge one of the many quotes from our Indigenous community members who spoke at those first public testimony meetings. As Honorable Urbina had mentioned, the state of Arizona had hosted several listening sessions throughout the state alongside and in partnership with Valaura Imus-Nahsonhoya. And we did this again this past year. So this is just one quote from those initial sessions from a woman who said, and I quote, "No one seeks answers in these murders. And if the authorities investigate, they don't share what they know, or nobody comes to tell us what they've discovered. Even if there's not a conclusion, there's no ongoing updates. At this time, I don't know if my granddaughter will ever come home. We are still waiting," end quote. So this highlights that this is not just research. People are not just numbers, but this is about real people. This is a real problem. And this is something that deserves a humanistic and person-centered approach. So how did we do it? So we collected existing data. We took a two-pronged approach. So for missing persons data, we looked at the National Missing and Unidentified Persons Database, also known as NamUs. This is a publicly accessible database that you can go on right now to NamUs's website, and anyone in this audience, anyone in the United States can input the information about a missing loved one right then and there. That goes to law enforcement, and that is vetted through law enforcement. So we examined 15 consecutive weeks of missing persons data on the NamUs website. We also, in terms of homicide data, we examined the government's Federal Bureau of Investigation Uniform Crime Report, or the UCR, for the past 40 years. As Honorable Urbina had mentioned, this is not something that started 40 years ago. It started with colonization 500 plus years ago, but our data was limited to 40 years, a span of 40 years. So I'll show you some findings very briefly. In the interest of time, I don't have much time to go in depth, but I do have flyers that have some more information about our findings. I'll have those available at the table over here after our presentation. And also you can go to our website, the Research on Violent Victimization website, and you can see our full report. So we found that reported murders of Indigenous women and girls had been increasing, steadily increasing over the past 40 years. We fully expect that trend to continue, especially given COVID-19 and all that is the complexities surrounding the pandemic. I want to also highlight what you see in red here, the left side bar chart. You'll see this is the known perpetrators of who is committing homicides of our Indigenous women and girls. The largest category is unknown. This is unacceptable. This highlights that there is so much that is not known, not collected, or has been unable to be collected at this point. Although the state of Arizona had focused on Indigenous women and girls, in other words, MMIWG, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, we also collected data on Indigenous men and boys. And so I'd just like to share briefly, let me move forward. I'd like to share briefly that the reported homicides of our Indigenous males were higher than those of Indigenous females, and has been increasing since 2015, or I should say, there has been a reported increase. That may not necessarily mean that homicides are increasing. It may be that there's more awareness, and so more are reported in recent years. This also does not mean that Indigenous males are murdered more often than Indigenous females. I want to emphasize the word reported. This is reported homicides to police officers, and that data then goes to the Federal Bureau of Investigations. So these are known homicides. In the end, there's too much missing data on the missing and murder of Indigenous peoples, and the data are clearly not meeting the needs of Indigenous peoples. So I'll share briefly with you the research that our team does and the methods that we employ to ensure that we are protecting our Indigenous peoples who participate in our research. So in addition to the University Institutional Review Board, Jacob Moore had mentioned this earlier today, it's IRB, Institutional Review Board. The university has an institutional review board, and all research that is conducted by faculty or staff within the university or students must go through an application process. This means that the researchers, including students, must go through a training protocol, and that the training certificate must be submitted to the IRB, Institutional Review Board application. And research that is being conducted with Indigenous peoples is also subjected to a very rigorous cultural review that's done by Dr. Brayboy, Mr. Jacob Moore and their team. And so this is something that that is standard within all ASU research. We also applied culturally appropriate methodology as well. So we took special care due to the very sensitive topic of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. We took a very trauma-centered approach, a very person-centered approach. And the way that we did this, I'll just mention just a few in the interest of time. We carefully vetted all of our data collection instruments within our team and outside of our team. We met for hours and hours and hours a week for several months to really scrutinize each and every data collection tool that we have. We also, when Valaura Imus-Nahsonhoya was conducting interviews with our Indigenous community members, our Indigenous students, she burned sage and offered a prayer to really center participants. And often, I think always, they expressed thanks and gratitude, appreciation for that. We provided smudge kits for our participants. We encouraged our participants to connect with Native Connections. Native Connections has a partnership with ASU, and ASU students can go through talking circles with Native Connections, which is wonderful. We also hosted several pizza parties in collaboration with AISSS, the American Indian Student Support Services, to educate, advocate, and provide resources and training on the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis. We continue to work with our ASU partners who serve Indigenous students to develop policy relevant and culturally appropriate recommendations. And then the last one I'll mention in the interest of time is that we also hosted a call for art, which Jacob had mentioned and Chris Sharp had mentioned as well, that you'll see in the back up here and also behind us, or I think on the second floor as well. We have the submissions that our ASU students had contributed to showcase and honor and educate and advocate for MMIP work. So with that, I'm sure I'm over my time, but I'll pass this back over to Valaura, and thank you.
No, I love listening to Dr. Fox. Okay, let's see here. As mentioned, my career is in advocacy, 20 years in victim advocacy. And part of my collaboration and the influence that I had with the lab is that I needed to ensure that we were following practices that was victim-centered, trauma-informed, and also being culturally relevant to what Dr. Kate has mentioned. Part of this study, our first study, was to also include our families and survivors. We wanted to learn from our families and survivors of their experiences. So this was another piece that we did with LaCroix and Milligan and Associates. But I also want to note that, you know, part of my work is not wanting to be part of the state ad hoc committee meeting is because I needed to make sure that I was addressing our families and survivors in the most respectful way. Being a committee members, those are some of the things that I wouldn't be able to do. So I elected not to be a committee member, but to be a tribal liaison and a study coordinator, working with all of our study researchers. In this PowerPoint, you know, we really wanted to examine what our families and survivors shared with us in their experiences to improve some of our services, improving policy and protocols. And we even established some of these laws and codes and working with tribes and strengthening their laws and codes. This timeline here is a brief overview of what we experienced. Unfortunately, you know, we had 7 months to do this study, and also COVID had happened. Our intent was to interview every survivor and family in person, but due to COVID and also the shutdown of all tribal administration, you know, we were very limited with what we had to do. However, part of this process was also, as I am not a researcher, I'm not a professor, I don't work in a university, I'm from the community, but I needed to learn what this IRB process was. And I spent vigorous hours with all of these courses and everything. Like, I counted over 18 hours of classes I had to do to get certified, to learn all of this stuff. So, you know, it was very extensive for me, but I'm very grateful for this opportunity. So during this process of our study as well, part of my role was to talk to our tribal leadership. Representative Germain and I went to each tribe in Arizona to share what this study was about. We wanted to be transparent in what we were doing. That was very critical to me, that we needed to share exactly what we're going to do and for them to see who we are, our faces, and get to know our faces in the work that we were going to do moving forward. Unfortunately, as our previous panel stated, some tribes don't have IRB processes. Honorable Urbina was gracious enough to share his expertise in creating MOUs for tribes that did not have IRB processes, and we work with those tribes to implement some of these MOUs and help some of our tribal leadership and council members understand what this MOU meant, what this research meant. And we had, I'm gonna move on to here. So with that, you know, we were able to get 8 MOUs from our 22 tribes. Again, remember, many of our tribal offices were shut down, where they weren't even working at all. But we were gracious enough to at least get 8 of our tribes to be able to participate in this study. Through the interviews, I also interviewed all of these individuals and these families, these survivors. And you know, I'm very fortunate again to be part of this process in learning about their experiences, to documenting some of their challenges, some of their highlights of their cases of their loved one that was missing and or murdered. One of the areas that, you know, I'm very proud that, you know, we had individuals and survivors who also came forward to share their stories. They didn't share with us immediately their gender, but throughout conversation and gaining trust in these interviews, they were very open in sharing with me what their identities were. So we did get 2 interviews of 2 transgender individuals. Their experiences and sharing with us and really bringing for me, it was a highlight of how these individuals were missing. They experienced abuse and violence. They experienced induced drug kidnapping, whether they were being groomed or actually being trafficked. So these experiences highlighted some of, you know, what our other survivors, female survivors shared and their experiences as well. We also interview our law enforcement agencies. And on this slide, I'll share with you how many jurisdictions and municipalities that we did interview. And these interviews also highlighted what their challenges were, what their recommendations to our committee was to also improve their ability to respond to these type of cases. If you know, our report is online, but when you read it, you're going to really understand and identify how our families and survivors and how our law enforcement responses and these challenges that they have. But for us to be able to pull it together and give recommendations as a committee, these are things that we were able to do in strengthening these services, not just for law enforcement, but for our families and survivors as well. What is up here? So again, our study was very limited. And as mentioned earlier, this just kind of summarizes what I spoke of earlier and some of our challenges that we had during our study. But our successes through this process in interviewing our families and survivors, although we had this short frame of time to obtain MOUs, we were still able to listen and hear from our survivors and families on their experiences. We also increased our relationship with our tribal leadership in being present in our research, in our committees, and providing testimony and increasing their own codes and laws in their own communities. We have many families and survivors who trust us. They're continuing to be present with us, whether it's in our committee meetings or any other outreach and community events that we're having. They're still being there. They're standing right beside us and sharing their experiences. We also have an increase of our law enforcement agencies that have come forward and are wanting to learn and continue to learn in building these relationships with our families and survivors, again, so we can enhance these services in these type of cases. The advocacy work, we also interview our advocates throughout Indian country here in Arizona and some of our county advocacy. So what we learned from them as well, and these were their recommendations, the challenges that they have with not only staffing, but training. In my experience in working with domestic violence, sexual assault, and other types of violence, missing and murdered response was very different for me. And how I was able to approach them and provide the advocacy is not how I would approach a domestic violence or sexual assault victim. So these experiences, again, really strengthened my ability of how I'm going to be able to respond to these families. And it was really about this trust, the trust that we had to obtain within a minute, literally. And because I just met them, right? And for me to be able to talk about this sensitive issue, sometimes intimate discussions, they had to learn how to trust me. And I did this through Zoom. I did this through Facebook, the video or something on Facebook, because of the accessibility of our reservations that did not have the technology. So these were just some guidance that we did get from them as well throughout our study.
I'm gonna, since we're running out of time, I'm
Yeah.
gonna go ahead and jump in here. Thank you for sharing. I just want to ask each one of you just one in a minute or less. And I'll start with you, Fred. What do you see are the next steps in terms of advancing this research to create policy change?
Well, each report and the forthcoming report will have several pages of recommendations that we hope will be followed up either by tribal governments, the state government, or federal governments. That happened to quite a bit in between the first study and the second study. So we already have legislators who are going to basically take the mantle, and in the next session, they'll be able to look at the legislative recommendations and propose them in the next session for the state Senate and House.
Thank you. Valaura, with that being said, what as you as a grassroots activist and advocate, what would you need from the audience here or from people that are watching today? How can they support the work and the policy changes?
We are always looking for help. This particular topic, like as mentioned, is very sensitive. Just being present with us in these events that we're hosting. May 5th is our biggest event, to be present with us at the state capitol to show your support, because we have families and survivors present as well. And when they see us in our capacities as in whether it's research or your own professionalism, you're showing an interest in them that they're going to capture off of you. And this is what has strengthened us as not only a committee, but the work that we do to show our families and survivors that we do care. And that's the biggest impact that we can have as all of you.
Thank you. Kate, any next steps that you want to share with the audience?
Thank you, Chris. In terms of a research perspective, I would say that student involvement is key. Students on the team have taught us so many things and are a vital part of this work. As just one small example of that, both Cassie, shout out to Cassie and Catania, who were able to finally mobilize our team to get on social media. We were living in the dark ages for a while, and then we finally realized I finally realized, in learning from them, that is the way to connect with communities. That is the way to get the work out there. That is the way to move this and really make change. And so that's just one small example of the next generation really is teaching us and moving that research into a really mobilizing it and seeing change. So thank you, Chris.
And thank you. Just please bear with me. I'm going to read an acknowledgement that I put into the final study, and I think it's a good way to close. Thank you to the entire study committee and the advocates that moved this legislation to become a reality. I want to acknowledge Kate Fox, the entire research team, and our Indigenous scholars who put their hearts into this project. Thanks for allowing me to be part of this initial step on the journey to raising awareness and addressing the MMIP problem. I want to acknowledge that MMIP is not new and took roots in the first encounters with the Columbus voyage and subsequent attempts to subdue and colonize Indigenous peoples. I acknowledge all of those ancestor women and girls and relatives that were murdered or went missing. They are unnamed but not forgotten. By acknowledgement, we can take the next steps towards healing. Meaningful acknowledgement requires action as a society to prevent and end MMIP. I would like to acknowledge all those families that have been impacted by MMIP. Please know that this work will continue. You are always in our minds as we do this work, and you will not be forgotten. Thank you.
You're done. So, okay, sorry. Sorry. Appreciate it. So.
Thank you.